For the last couple of weeks, we've looked at God and seen His holiness and His glory, learned of His eternal nature, that He is our Creator, that He, because He created everything that we understand, He exists outside of it. For example, we saw that He created time when He created light and separated light from the darkness. And He called that the evening and the morning, the first day. God called it that. He exists outside of time. He exists outside of our existence, but He also exists within our existence, in that He is also everywhere and a part of us, that we are made in His image. Last week, we looked at this idea that God knows good and evil. Despite His holiness, He understands the difference. However, His holiness demands that He not ever choose to do what is evil. I said something to the effect of, not only would it not even enter His mind, but even if it did, it's so beyond His character that He would laugh it off. So why would I even think of something like that? But God does know good and evil. And we saw in Genesis 3, 8, and 9 that God saw Adam and Eve naked, and He was not ashamed. He created Adam and Eve naked. When they had seen their own nakedness and they were ashamed and hid from Him, He saw them naked, but God was not ashamed. He knows good and evil, but He is so holy and perfect in His character and His nature. There's one for next week, Jermaine, Sarah, and Kim, that He is holy and perfect in His nature. He's so holy and perfect in His nature that all He sees is the naked flesh. We also saw that God sees what man does not see. God sees the heart. We don't see that. We only see what is on the outside and what the inward says, the bearing of the fruits. We also have seen that we, as God's creation, we are made in His image. We are made in His likeness. We saw that we are eternal in our nature, unlike God's eternal nature, where apparently God has no beginning. We have a beginning. We have a clear beginning. The book of Genesis and other ancient stories tell us of our origins, that God created us. But we have no end, and that is how we are made in the image of God, that we have no end. We are a spiritual creature, but we are limited by this flesh. Our spiritual nature is bound by the terms of this creation. Our entire existence is based on time, whereas God exists outside of it and can see beyond it. We don't understand existence without it. Even the concept of eternity, without beginning, without end, is completely foreign to us, because our entire existence is based on beginnings and endings. Seasons come and go, beginnings and endings. Days come and go, beginnings and ending. Life comes and goes, beginnings and endings. But there is a part of us that has no end, that will live on eternally with God or without God. But unlike God, who is not made, we were made. And unlike God, who is not made, He knows good and evil, but cannot choose what is evil. Man was made without the knowledge of good and evil. God created us to not know good and evil. He made us not having that knowledge, even though He did. But when we learned good and evil, we became ashamed. Unlike God, who knows good and evil, doesn't see as we see, He is not ashamed. When we see sin, when Adam and Eve saw their nakedness, they were ashamed and they hid from their God for fear of Him, and out of, I would say rightly so, being shamed of their nakedness. Today we're going to look at some more ideas that have been associated with God and being created in His image. And we're going to look at them under this first idea, is that God created man alive. We're going to look at life and death in the next couple of weeks. Today we're going to focus a lot on death. And today I'm going to do something I don't normally like to do, which is everything we're going to read from the Scriptures I'm going to have up here. Not because there's too much, but because everything there is goes back and forth. And we'd be losing a lot of time going back and forth. And even just studying and putting these things together, it was difficult to keep my pages separate. So for my convenience sake, primarily, I'm going to have everything on the screen today. But feel free, if you like, to be able to go back and forth with your Bibles. Maybe you have you're seated, so it might be easier for you. But I'm going to have everything up here and have everything highlighted up here. So let's get started. God created man alive. Now that seems to be something obvious, but it's important that we understand that. God made us living. Yeah, we didn't start that way because God had to breathe into man the breath of life, and man became a living being. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is when God made Adam alive, He made him alive both spiritually and physically. Adam and Eve were both alive spiritually and physically. It's important that we understand that. And that when God saw that all that He had made, after He made man and woman, He saw that all He had made and made them, and He saw them as very good. After all, we are made in His image, and He is extremely good, so we must also be very good. And we were made spiritually alive and physically alive. Whatever God is in spirit, we have a part of that ourselves. God is life. We are also made in that image. We were at one point alive spiritually, purely, without knowledge of good and evil. And think about this. Not only did God make us alive spiritually and physically, we were made to live eternally. Not just spiritually, but on the earth. Think about that. In Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve sinned, God created a barrier between the very thing that would have allowed man to live in the flesh, on the earth, eternally. The Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and live forever." Remember, there were two trees that God put in the middle of the garden. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, which He said, "You must not eat from this tree, or the day you eat of it you will die." And the tree of life. According to Genesis 3, verse 22, neither Adam nor Eve had yet taken from the tree of life that would have allowed them to live eternally on the earth forever. Now, whether that meant they eat from it one time, and that would have been enough, or if it would have been one of their regular food sources, I don't know. I don't think that it matters. What does matter is they had not yet taken from it, and not only was it that they had to get them out of the garden, God had to guard the way to the tree of life so that He could not get to it again. He drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, He stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. That doesn't exist now. Don't know what happened to it. Probably destroyed in the flood. Don't know, don't care. But with the knowledge of good and evil that man now has from eating the tree of knowledge, God cannot allow man to live eternally on the earth in the flesh. That was not what God made man to do. Without the knowledge of good and evil, as God made Adam and Eve, eat from the tree of life. God said, "Eat freely from everything in the garden, except the one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil." But because they ate from that one tree, now they have that knowledge, they can no longer eat from the tree of life and live forever. And by doing so, what comes upon man? Death. Because we cannot get to the tree of life, the body wears out, the body decays, and the body dies. Death comes from the knowledge of good and evil, and because we do not have access to the one thing that would have allowed us to live forever on the earth. So because God made us alive, God also made us able to die. God had the tree of life there so that we could have lived forever, but there was that possibility of death. The physical body would have worn out. God designed that into us. He designed it into the creation. He designed it into everything, that physical death was possible, But not just physical death. Spiritual death. And this is extremely important we understand. That not only did God make us able to live eternally, spiritually, and physically, He also made us to be able to die spiritually and physically. That part of us that is made in God's image can die. Not like the flesh. That's a different kind of death. The flesh dies forever. There's no bringing it back. It goes back to the ground from whence it came. God said in Genesis 2:17, the day you eat from it, you will surely die. One of the questions people have all the time about Genesis 2, God said they will die. Well, they did die. They died spiritually. Their souls, their spirits, that part of them that was made in the image of God, died. Why? Because they did the very thing God told them not to do. They sinned. They violated God's law, and they died spiritually. Now, we'll see in a little while that this commandment about dying was not limited to spiritual death. We'll see that in a little bit. But it is important that we understand spiritual death was a consequence of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When we die, when we sin, we die spiritually. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world. Paul was writing to people who were alive on the earth, who once were dead, but still walking the earth. What was the death that they had walking the earth? It wasn't physical death. It was spiritual death. You once were dead spiritually in your trespasses and sins, but alive physically. Colossians 2 verse 13. When you were dead in your transgressions, sins, He made you alive together with Him. Again, the Colossians were alive on the earth physically, but were spiritually dead. We can be spiritually dead, but physically alive. How is that possible? Because as a general rule, especially in the case of Adam and Eve, spiritual death comes before physical death. Remember that. Spiritual death comes before physical death. That's the general rule. Now, we live in a time where a person can die physically and not die spiritually. Children, Sammy, Eva, all little children, have not died spiritually, but they are alive physically. They can die physically, but they won't have died spiritually. Why? They have not transgressed the laws of God. They have not sinned. But in the case of Adam and Eve, they had a law. Don't eat from this tree. They died spiritually before they died physically. The general law of life on this earth is spiritual life ends first. Physical life ends second. Spiritual death, then physical life. That's the general rule. And the reason, going back to Adam and Eve, God said the day you eat of it you will surely die. Spiritual death causes physical death. Why were Adam and Eve, Genesis 3:17. When God cursed Adam and Eve, to Adam He said, you have eaten from the tree about which I have commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. And told you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Adam was spiritually dead when God said this, but he was physically alive. The curse of life on this earth, spiritual death comes before physical death. And because we are bound by this earth, bound by this flesh, for many people it becomes easy to disregard even the concept of spiritual death. Why? We can't see it. We can't see the Spirit's inside of us. We don't comprehend it. We don't feel it. We can't see it, hear it, taste it, touch it. It only exists in the Spirit. And we only know that because of knowledge. God has told us it exists. We believe it on faith. Spiritual death causes physical death. The reason we can no longer live, we cannot live on the earth eternally, is because God denied us access to the one thing that would allow us to live eternally on the earth. The tree of life. God expelled man from the garden so that we could not take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. We were forbidden from it because when we spiritually die, we physically die. God does not want us living on the earth spiritually dead. He doesn't want us living on the earth eternally spiritually dead. That's not what He made this creation for. We'll come back to that in a little bit. What causes spiritual death? Sin causes spiritual death. It seems obvious to say it. Oh yeah, duh. But when you say it and we acknowledge it, we need to understand. Sin is not just some abstract noun that we understand from the Bible. Sin is the cause of spiritual death. Spiritual death is the cause of physical death. There's a cause, there's a reason, there's an origin for the life that we live on this earth, bound by this flesh, shame and wickedness and evil and hate, violence. All those things are a result of sin, spiritual death, and physical death. There's a couple passages that in the New Testament that kind of tell us what sin really is. In James 4 verse 17, James says, the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now in the context of James 4, he's talking about things that belong to the individual. There's things that I believe to be, in my opinion, to be wrong. And if I violate my conscience, then I sin. But there are also commandments that God has given us. And when we know those commandments, and we violate them anyway, then we sin. Did Adam and Eve know the right thing to do? She stated it. God has said, do not eat from that tree. She knew the law. She knew the right thing to do and did it anyway. So to her and him, it became sin. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Fundamentally, lawlessness means without law. But in a more deeper meaning, lawlessness means violation of law. Violation of law is lawlessness. Did Adam and Eve have a law? Yes, they did. Don't eat from that tree. Did they violate the law? Yes, they did. They were lawless. They lived for a brief time in lawlessness. How much they sinned after that, we can only assume that they did. To what extent, we don't know because we're not told. But 1 John also tells us, if we say we have no sin, we lie. So we must assume at some point Adam and Eve violated some other law that God gave them. Don't know what it was, but we know one of their children violated a law of God when he murdered his brother, and God punished him for that. In James chapter 1, James gives us the progression of sin. We talked about sin causing spiritual death causing physical death. But James 4 didn't really tell us how sin develops. Here's how James tells us how sin develops. James 1 verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted. Sin starts with temptation. Eve lived some period of time on the earth, and so did Adam, without sinning. Apparently, there was no temptation to sin. We talked about that last week. How when they saw the tree of life, they saw bad. They had no perception of it as being something a delight to the eyes, good for food, desirable to make one wise. They didn't see it that way. They were not tempted by it. James says, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Some people have a hard time with, why did God even put that tree in the garden in the first place? God really caused the sin. James flat out says, God cannot be tempted by evil, and He Himself does not tempt anyone. God didn't tempt Adam and Eve to sin. Where was God when Eve saw the fruit, that it was delight to the eyes and good for food and desire to make one wise? Where was He? He wasn't there. Next to her, who was? The serpent. The serpent was there. He was the tempter. He was the one who tempted her to good and evil. Romans 7 verse 12. There's this question about the commandment from Romans 7. The commandment being unlawful. But Paul in Romans says the law is holy. And the commandment is holy and righteous and good. The commandment to not eat from that tree was holy and righteous and good. But then there's that question which some people have. Well, God put that tree there. He put that temptation there. For some period of time, there was no temptation. And God's commandment to not eat from that tree was righteous and holy and good. Why? Because God knew the day they ate from it, they would surely die. First spiritually, then physically. God knew that. So the commandment was holy and good. So Paul poses a question. Well, did that which is good become a cause of death for me? Was the commandment the cause of death? No. The commandment was holy and righteous and good. Paul says, may it never be. Rather, it was sin. Sin was the cause of death. Why? How? In order that it might be shown to be sin, by affecting death through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin would become utterly sinful. In other words, God put the tree there and gave the commandment to show the difference between good and evil. So even in saying God made man not knowing good and evil, in some way God educated both Adam and Eve in the knowledge of good and evil. Here is the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You can eat from this tree, but not from this tree. For in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Life versus death. This is the fundamental difference between God and Satan, between good and evil, life and death. The knowledge of good and evil was the difference between the two. And God put the tree there and gave the commandment to show the difference. This is good and this is evil. This is life and this is death. And God exhorted them, choose life. Don't choose death, choose life. Moving on in James chapter 1 verse 14. God does not tempt, but we are tempted when each one of us is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Our own lusts tempt us to sin. What was the lust of Eve? 1 John 2 verse 16, all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and boastful pride of life. That is fundamentally all sin. Is all of those things or some combination of those things? All sin is. Well, what was Eve's sin? When the woman saw the tree was good for food, the lust of the flesh, a delight to the eyes, the lust of the eyes, and desirable to make one wise, the boastful pride of life. She was as wise as God wanted her to be, as God designed her to be. But Satan And the lust of her flesh tempted her, and that made her want more. That is the boastful pride of life. And then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Look at that phrasing. That phrasing was chosen by James for a reason. When lust is conceived. The image is of pregnancy of a woman. When a woman becomes pregnant, she conceives what? Life. And she gives birth to life. But lust, when it conceives, doesn't give birth to life. It gives birth to death. Romans 7, again, verse 5. In the flesh, the sinful passions, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, which are aroused by the law. What was aroused by the law? The sinful passions, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life. You will not surely die, was the lust of the flesh and the boastful pride of life. For God knows the day you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Verse 9 of Romans 7. When the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. When lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And the commandment was given as holy and righteous and good to tell us, this is good, this is bad, this is life, this is death. Choose life. But when lust conceives, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, or when sin is born, this is still in James 1, it brings forth death. That is the law. That is no violation. God can't violate that law. Sin brings death. God is life. And that is just one of the reasons why God cannot choose what is evil. Because God is life. And God knows sin brings death. Sin is evil, so God cannot do what is evil. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. People talk about what is earned versus what is given. What did God give to Adam and Eve? He gave them life. Did He give them death? No. They got that for themselves when they chose to disobey. When they chose to become slaves of sin. When they were tempted and let that temptation conceive in their hearts, and sin became alive within them, and that sin brought forth death. God said it from the very beginning. The day you eat of it, you will surely die. And the first death they experienced was spiritual death. And James finishes this section by saying, do not be deceived. They were deceived. In some ways, they might have willingly been deceived. Oh, that sounds so good to me in my lusts of my flesh and the lusts of my eyes and the boastful pride of life. And in some ways, they were just flat out deceived. We must not be deceived by sin. Sin brings death. First spiritual, then physical. Again, spiritual death is the cause of physical death. I want to end the day talking about this idea again, that spiritual death is the cause of physical death. In Romans 5, verse 12, through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. This is not talking about spiritual death. This is talking about physical death. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. Now some would say, oh, see, all sin, even the children sin. But in verse 14 of Romans 5, Paul says this, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam. What's the offense of Adam? Rebellion. Choosing death over life. Children can't choose death over life. Why? There's no comprehension of it. They don't understand it. They have no knowledge of good and evil. So they can't choose life or death over life. Nor can they choose life over death. They're already alive because God made them alive. They have no knowledge of good and evil. And even beyond children, we have examples of people like, there should be some, we have examples like Noah. Noah lived in the time between Adam and Moses. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Apparently, Noah did not sin in the likeness of Adam. How do we know that? Because unlike everybody else in the world, Noah was spared the destruction. Genesis 6 verse 5, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, except Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Genesis 6 verse 12, God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth, except Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, so he found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6 verse 13, then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Because of them, behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. So God told Noah, build for yourself an ark. And he gave all the things that went along with building the ark, including taking his 3 sons and all the 4 of them's wives and all the animals that would have gone into the ark. Why? Because Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. But death still reigned in the life of Noah. Death reigned in the life of Noah in a way that we can't comprehend. Though we have a lot of stories and movies and TV shows now that talk about post-apocalyptic life. Noah lived a post-apocalyptic life. Noah lived a pre-apocalyptic life. He was divinely warned by God, I'm about to destroy the earth. So Noah built an ark. He lived in that time, knowing it was coming. Was only able to save 7 other people. And for some period of time, those 8 people lived in a post-apocalyptic world. Just those 8. Why? Because the end of all flesh has come before the Lord. He destroyed all that had the breath of life, except for all that were on that boat. Death reigned, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of Adam. Abraham and Lot are another example of 2 people who lived between the time of Adam and Moses. Abraham is even called the father of the faithful. And yet, death reigned in their lives. This is an example of that death. Sodom and Gomorrah. Both Abraham and Lot were a part of the story, the narrative of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Before I got to go back to this. Why did God destroy the pre-flood world? Because there was only evil in the heart of man, wickedness. Why did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? We learn in Genesis 13, verse 13, the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Genesis 18, verse 20, the Lord said to Abraham, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. And the Lord goes on to tell Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And only Lot and his 2 daughters were spared that destruction. Not even Lot's wife escaped the destruction. Why? Because they were told, don't look back. And she looked back. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam. Lot and Abraham did not sin in the likeness of Adam, and yet death reigned in their lives. Abraham died. It's recorded for us in the Scriptures. Noah died. It's recorded for us in the Scriptures. Lot died. Death reigns. Why? Because Adam and Eve chose death over life. God did not design man to live eternally on the earth with the knowledge of good and evil. Physical